And also more broadly, Nayla's research focuses on democracy, digital communication, and journalism. And in addition to studying media and populism, she also examines topics like the effects of populist communication, trust in the news, trust in the media, and so on. So thank you, Nayla, for joining us. We really look forward to your talk, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here and talk to you about the relationship between populism and the media. I will put, as you said, a focus on audience perspective, but I will also talk a little bit about the demand side of populism, because here we can see that there is an obvious relationship between populism and the media, as we can see in many countries where populist actors have gained power and are more and more attacking, fundamentally attacking the media. The most prominent example, of course, is Donald Trump. Already during his first term, he called the media fake news, enemy of the American people. And now in his second term, we can observe how he is fundamentally attacking legacy media and press freedom. But also in Germany and in other European countries, we see this special relationship. In Germany, it mainly started around 2015 with the Pegida movement and the so-called lying press, like the Lügenpresse debate, and with the AfD, like the Alternative for Germany, the right-wing, now far-right populist party that also is constantly attacking legacy media, and which will also be my focus because I mainly study Germany, so there will be a lot about Germany today. So I want to briefly talk about what is populism. It is a very contested, difficult concept, and then briefly talk about the supply side, populist actors and the media, and then talk about the audience, like populist citizens and the media. So what is populism? It is a very contested concept because due to its interdisciplinary focus, so it has very different understandings in different disciplines, but also within political science, communication science, we find different understandings. And I think it is important to acknowledge that they actually describe just some different parts of populism. So populism as a thin ideology set the ideas and focus of the content of populism. The approach of a communication style is more the mode of presentation. So this is like the form of populist communication. And the approach of populism as a strategy refers to populism as a means. So it focuses on the aims, the motives of populism, and the same with populism as a discourse practice. And I will come back to that later. I brought you the most famous, I would say, definition of populism now from Müller, who defines populism as an ideology, a thin ideology that separates society into homogenic and antagonistic groups, the pure people versus the corrupt elite. And what is also very important, that populism is always and understands as an expression of the volonté générale, the general will of the people. And here I want to explain this populist ideology briefly in a model where you can see that sovereignty is always at the core. The people who deserve the right to have this sovereignty, and the elite, they are portrayed as a group that betrays the people, deprives them of their sovereignty, while the populist leaders challenges the elite and wants to restore, presumes to restore sovereignty back to the people. And this is very important, that they claim to have the moral monopoly of the sovereignty. So only them are able to really represent the true will of this assumed homogeneous group of the people, and therefore advocate for the people. And then there's an ongoing debate on whether a group of others is also part of a populist ideology, or whether this is like an add-on to like nativism, for example. And we argue in this paper that it is very difficult to form the group of a homogeneous in-group without excluding others from as an out-group. So I think it is important to acknowledge this also as part of a populist ideology, because a group of others is always portrayed in rivalry to the homogeneous people, and therefore excluded by a populist ideology. So we have then here 4 dimensions of populist ideology, and in my research I mainly focus on right-wing populist ideology, and that's the homogeneity of the people, sovereignty of the people, the anti-elite populism, and the anti-outgroup populism. There is an ongoing debate on how to normatively address populism. There are authors who point out that populism can act as a corrective in democratic discourse by pointing out problems that have been overlooked by political parties, forces elites to expand the political agenda. For example, it has a mobilization potential, and some call it kind of a cleansing measure that is necessary from time to time to save representative democracy, as the challenge of dealing with populism can lead actually to strengthening democracy. However, as we also can observe in many countries, populism also has a lot of danger, potential of danger for democracy, and that is mainly due to its anti-pluralism. So defining the true people, marginalizing certain group is anti-democratic. And what we can observe in many countries, like in Germany, in the beginning, we were discussing whether the AfD is a populist or non-populist country, and now it paved the way to extremism. And this is what we can observe in many countries. And we can also observe negative effects on the quality of the political discourse and the disregard for the principles of checks and balances, which fuels mistrust in democratic institutions. And I want to take a closer look at legacy media as an institution. So first, I said I want to briefly discuss or show the supply side, and I think this is important because to be aware of this when taking a look at the audience side. So there is what has been described very often intensively, that there is a high compatibility of populists, and that's why I made this distinction. It's mainly the populist strategy and the style that is highly compatible to the media logic, and especially to online opportunity structure. So the emotional communication, simplification, the focus on negativity, that all goes very well with news values, with the media logic. So when media are often accused that maybe also unintentionally they contribute to the visibility and the success of populism and the normalization of right-wing populist narratives with the way they cover populist and especially right-wing populist actors. On the other hand, I already mentioned that the same actors who then profit from media publicity and media coverage fundamentally attack media criticism, fundamentally attack the media by criticism very harshly and delegitimizing attacks, which we can observe in many European countries. So this is actually kind of a paradox at the first glance. I will come back to that later, but what Ruth Wodak wrote years ago already, that this actually is a no-win situation for journalism, because it is a very difficult task for them how to cope with that. So I want to briefly show you some of these aspects and these accusations against the media. So first of all, how do the media actually portray populism? And this is not most recent, but this is like big European comparison on the way I think 11 European countries portray populist actors in their media coverage, and the blue bars here you can see, the right one are politicians in general, the left one are populist politicians, and you can see that populist actors are slightly covered more negative than other politicians, but all politicians are covered mostly negative in both quality and tabloid media coverage. And with tabloid, there is almost no difference between populists and other politicians. But we can also see that the media themselves have report in a populist method, so are a source of populism, for example, with an anti-elite populist messages in their coverage. So that's how they also contribute to these narratives. The other part, the delegitimizing of media, is, I think it's very important to distinguish between good and bad criticism, because this is, at least in Germany, my impression is that this is all seen as media criticism and not enough distinguished. So we need to distinguish between media criticism that points to the democratic function of the media and which aims at making journalism better. And we need to distinguish this from media criticism that does not want the well-functioning of journalism for democracy. So here we observe very generalized attacks instead of arguments, for example, fake news accusation, intentional distortions of reality, partisan bias. This is the use of incivil language, and very important, this is a part of a strategic use, a political struggle against established power elites, so where the media play one role. Oh, do you also have my my picture is a bit back again. Oh, sorry.
No worries. Is it the presentation or the camera?
The camera.
Oh yeah, I see. Yeah, you're gone.
Okay, sorry about that.
Yes, no worries.
So this is part of a general battle against democratic institutions, and the media are part of this attack. And we do see in lots of different studies that populist right-wing actors more often delegitimize the media in their online communication. And I already talked about that, especially the populist logic goes very well with the online logic. There's lots of studies, I'm sure you're aware of this, but I want to show you with the start of TikTok, how the most successful politicians in Germany were. So that's also not most current, but I want to show you when TikTok gained momentum, and here you can see the blue bars are those from the politicians from the Alternative for Germany. So the 10 most successful German politicians on TikTok, 6 were from the Alternative for Germany. And what we could also see is how successful they were in not only getting visibility, but also getting likes, getting shares, becoming present in here. This is an example on Facebook. So they had more users, much more likes. That's the AfD is the left bar, and the other parties you can see on the right, and more shares. And that's also what helped them to become so successful online. An international study I want to show you is how this is also different in Germany. Here you can see a comparison of Germany, Italy, Spain, and France. And you can see here the left one is always the populist politician compared with a non-populist politician. And we can see how this is part also of a strategy of angry reactions here as an example on how get their ideology spread online, but because these angry reactions in turn increase the number of shares and therefore increase the visibility. So that's just a very, very, very short quick on how the situation on the demand side looks. We could talk about this for ages, but what I want to show you is how this looks on the audience side. So the demand side of populism in the beginning of research often party preference as an indicator of populist affinity, so those who voted, for example, for the AfD. But then more and more, this is also not new, but I wanted to give you like very brief historical view on this, is that the populism as an ideology is not only found on the side of political actors and the media, but also as a worldview, like a mindset and attitudes on the side of citizens. So the four dimensions I explained to you earlier and can be understood as a mindset. And here there are several studies who research how these people differ from non-populist citizens in their media use. And we can clearly see that populist citizens tend to inform them much more on social media, use alternative parties and more media more often, also inform themselves more on TV, less on quality press. And what is interesting, they are self-aware that they therefore also have a higher exposure to mis and disinformation. But what is sometimes assumed, but what we don't see, is that they do not avoid news more often overall than non-populist citizens. And this is important also to have like in mind. In my research, what I take a look on is how populist attitudes go hand in hand with perceptions and evaluations of the media. So maybe after the media use, or before the next step. And here you can imagine like this populist worldview is kind of a lenses with how you perceive reality, how you perceive society, how you perceive then the media, science, etc. And I want to briefly discuss how these different dimensions clash with a populist ideology. So if we look at the sovereignty of the people homogeneity dimension, so if someone has a populist worldview, he or she thinks that there is this unified will of the people. So my opinion then is a majority opinion, because that's the will of the people. And very important, it's the only true and legitimate opinion. And that, of course, clashes with the anti-pluralistic character. And so that's the anti-pluralistic characters of populism, and that clashes with media populism. So media do have the task to take into account a wide range of attitudes, opinion, topics, and actors, and also include marginalized groups in their media coverage. And here we can already see how this clashes. The same is true for the second dimension, the populist anti-elite attitudes. So these political anti-elite attitudes are transferred to the media, and media perceived as part of the political establishment. There are different narratives. So media are controlled by politics, or the media subordinate themselves to politics, or a joint conspiracy between media and politics, maybe the most extreme one. So we have seen media coverage of populism indeed is negative and skeptical. So the perception that they maybe are then reported in an incorrect or distorted way than they perceive themselves is maybe not completely biased, but populists then take the demands we have towards the media, like objectivity, balance, and fight this against the media by claiming that they do not adhere to these principles of objectivity and balance, and we see that this then results to lower trust both in quality and tabloid media. The anti-outgroup attitudes also clash with media pluralism. The inclusion of minorities, discriminated groups to ensure social integration of all citizens is another important demand towards legacy media, and this is again clashes with the exclusion of these outgroups, and populists very often accuse the media then of reporting too positively on outgroups such as migrants or refugees and deliberately concealing possible negative events. So empirical research, several of the studies I conducted, we can clearly see that there is this connection between populist attitudes and lower trust, more hostility towards the media, more hostile media perception, and lower perceived media representation. And that's why I think it's very important to distinguish in populism between strategy and ideology, but because in the beginning I said a strategy is very highly compatible to the media logic, but the populist ideology, here we can see that there is a strong clash to the normative expectations of the media and the way also the media cover political news. And these expectations are actually what I want to explain, show you a recent study of mine, because what I've shown you before is very often media evaluation. So the media populists accuse the media of a biased coverage, for example, but that doesn't tell us what populist citizens actually expect from legacy media, from journalism. And here I don't have to tell you much what the media should do to strengthen democracy. We know that this goes from information function to watchdog to social empathy, being a public forum. And usually it is assumed that if the media implement these functions, they contribute to strengthening the democracy. What is currently discussed in particular against the backdrop of democratic regression in many countries, that whether the media have to go one step further by actively defending democracy and what is called a pro-democracy journalism. I want to quickly show you what this contains. Jay Rosen from Columbia University was maybe one of the starting points where he said, now after Trump, we have to discuss the role of journalism again, because in journalism studies and also in practical teaching of journalism students, there is no chapter on how to cover democratic backsliding in the US journalism playbook. So it always assumed that journalism lives in a democratic in Western countries. This totally, of course, looks very different in many countries around the world. So we could learn from journalism there. But if we look at how journalism is taught at university and other places, it hasn't been addressed before. Young and Kaiser and McGregor, they developed like a framework of democracy-framed electoral coverage, which they developed after the discussion about the election fraud after Trump's first term. And they developed how journalism should report and in the service of protecting electoral institutions. So pro-democracy journalism explicitly alert the population to attacks on democracy, strengthens democratic process and institution. It promotes and actively defends democratic values, norms, and rules. And very importantly, it classifies and contextualizes anti-democratic and illiberal messages, actors, parties to take a stance against attacks on democracy and to avoid normalizing anti-democratic rhetoric and democratic backsliding, what I told you in the beginning, the media are very often accused of. doing. De Jonge has a very interesting paper. You are more aware, I guess, about that, that in Belgium, she discusses in her paper that how the difference between Wallonia and Flanders and how strong right-wing populist parties are in those two parts. And she, with qualitative interviews, she traced that back to a cordon sanitaire médiatique, both in the media and in politics. So maybe we could also discuss about that later. What is important is that for democracy, journalism is different from activism or interventionistic journalistic role. So it's not about supporting a specific policy like we can observe in climate policy, where we also have the discussion about journalism's role in climate change mitigation. Here, this is about being pro democracy, democratic values, not towards a specific policy. We studied this with online survey of an offline recruited sample of the German population, but we were also interested in how journalism themselves and politicians as a stakeholder that is very much concerned by this question. So we also surveyed journalists and politicians on all three state levels in the German parliaments. And here you can see the items that we used. So we asked whether the media should and how, and then do in their actual coverage communicate democratic rules and values to the population, how they strengthen democracy in Germany, and whether they take a stand against enemies of democracy. And the blue bars are the expectations, and for the journalists, it's how important this is in their journalistic self-conception. And you can see that all three groups do not differ much here. So the large majority of respondents wants the media to engage here, but if you look at the pink bars, that's the actual evaluation of the media, and here you can see that we see clear underperformance of these expectations. So the majority wants the media to be more pro-democratic in their actual coverage. There's quite a large group that observed that with their current coverage on political events, the media rather does not strengthen democracy or does not take a stand against enemies of democracy. And if we take a look how we can explain this, and now I come back to the populist attitudes, but I also, in this study, we only included anti-democratic attitudes. So this is also like a process in my research, as I discussed before, that in the beginning we look at populism, and as I said, this is like paved the way for extremism, and we can clearly see that these extremist attitudes and as well trust in the alternative for party and alternative for Germany goes hand in hand with lower expectations of these media. This is not very surprising, but it is interesting to note. I will come back to this in my summary. And we see a more even clearer, I have this in a bit larger picture for the politicians, where we can clearly see that politicians from the AfD do not want journalism to promote democracy, to promote democratic values. Maybe another that's not in this topic, but it may be interesting to see that politicians on the local level want the media to be much engaged more in pro-democracy and defend democracy more than politicians on the national level. So to sum up, we can see that these societal groups that have negative attitudes towards the oh no, I don't know. Sorry about that.
No worries, we can still see the presentation, but indeed the camera
So, okay, I continue. Those who are negative towards politics are also negative towards the media elite. So there's anti-media goes hand in hand with anti-politics. And the populist and anti-democratic attitudes go hand in hand with negative perceptions and relation of the media. And as I said, I think it's important to note that this also goes with lower expectations. They reject pro-democratic role of journalists, and this is important on how to address populism, because I don't know how it is in Belgium, but here it is very often discussed. So that if we include those positions more, if we maybe more balanced, then they maybe more satisfied with journalists and maybe put more trust in journalism. But what we see is that this, as I mentioned before, this fight against the democratic institutions also include the media, and what they rather want to abolish journalism as a democratic institution, as an epistemic authority. And the problem is that the stronger an anti-democratic parties and attitudes become, the lower the appreciation for pro-democratic journalism becomes, which has, of course, important implications. I showed you in the beginning also the strategy of populist access, because I think it's important to look at demand side and supply side together, like the audience perspective and what is happening on the political side, because we can see that the strategy of political actors to delegitimize legacy media is successful, and in the worldview, in the positions of populist citizens, this has, of course, a lot of implications for journalism, and which may be kind of an outview on future studies, because I think it's very important that journalists reflect more strongly on their role in society, their responsibility, and the expectations of their audience. And here I want to make another point, that it is really important to become more aware of the majority opinions, because we do see, and there's also research in Antwerp on this, that politicians and journalists misperceive public opinion, in particular the right-wing positions. And here, as the descriptive results I just showed you, see the majority does not criticize gender, does expect more engagement of journalism to strengthen democracy. And it is very important for journalists, I think, because they receive so much negative feedback, especially in social media, they overestimate the dissatisfied group. What is also important, I think, for journalism is to better explain this, their role, and the difference between being impartial toward political democratic parties, but not toward extremist or anti-democratic political actors, to avoid the false balance between those positions, and that journalism can be or should be partial for democracy. And the other thing is then that I think it's journalism's task to also better explain why legacy media's normative ideals are opposed to populism. So especially when it comes to the anti-pluralistic, anti-democratic aspects. Of course, this risk that they may be perceived by these socialist groups as even more detached, more part of the elite, and not as a neutral, but as a political actor by pursuing, which pursues a specific agenda. But I think this cannot be avoided, but maybe by communicating more openly the media's democratic values. Like, this is something newsrooms rarely do to their audience, and also that journalists themselves engage in media literacy programs and explain their audience what are the functions of media in democracies are, why they report in a specific manner, and why some positions do not receive the same amount than other positions. So I think that journalism have to become better here in explaining this. And for the audience side, and this is why I think engaging in media literacy programs is important, to also not only value the democratic role of journalism, but also value journalism in a financial way, because this also does not go hand in hand at the moment. Audience value these roles, but doesn't value journalism economically. So I think this is also important, and because media literacy is like supporting media literacy is kind of a democratic value as well. So thank you very much for your attention. I'm sorry about my camera. I will try again.
Thank you, Nayla, for this very interesting talk. Yeah, maybe, I don't know if you stop sharing, maybe then it works again. We can, yeah.